So in this lecture, I want to just give a brief overview of some of the things that you're going to be running into as you look at chapters 1 through 3 in the readings. And these are some things that as you're doing the readings, I'd like you to be paying attention to. One is just to think about some of the main isms that arise during this period, right? So you have Catholicism, which has obviously been around for centuries before this. You have the rise of Lutheranism with the Protestant Reformation. And then you also have, during the Renaissance, a kind of humanism that's being brought to the fore, right? And for all of these, it's interesting to think about why they arose and why they took the form that they did and what we can learn from them. So, for example, as you're thinking about Catholicism and as you're doing the reading, on the one hand, there's some disturbing things, right? Some of the darkest periods in the history of the Catholic Church are in the couple centuries leading up to the Protestant Reformation. And so the degree of worldliness, corruption, and so forth that are taking place in the Catholic Church is discouraging on the one hand, right? You can see how nationalism, whether people are, French or Italian and so forth, seems to become a bigger deal to people than their fitness to serve in office to be able to serve the church. But I think in the midst of that, in order to understand Protestantism, it helps to have a more solid understanding of the Catholic Church and what it was actually like, right? There's a way of thinking about theology, right, where you see the sacraments as being extremely important, right? That baptism is a first sacrament that gives you kind of a clean slate, but baptism doesn't deal with subsequent sins that you're going to commit after your baptism. So there are different types of penance and so forth that people may need to do in order to have full forgiveness for their sins, right? There's worries about being sent to purgatory, which most people assumed they would spend some time in purgatory, right? Because of different sins they've committed along the lines, and people trying to figure out how to make sense of this, right? So in order to understand Luther's critique, it's helpful to have an understanding of Catholicism and the way it was practiced. But one of the things I think the book does a good job of helping us to see is that it's wrong to think of Catholicism as a kind of monolith, right? That there's just sort of one thing that we call Catholicism, because there's different branches within the Catholic Church, and some of them are genuinely trying to bring about reform, but to try to bring about reform from within the system, right? So if you think of a humanist like Erasmus, he's a really interesting guy for multiple reasons. For one, it's a good reminder that humanism meant something different then than it does now. Normally, when we hear a phrase like humanism, we assume it means people who are completely secular, reject God, and so forth. That's certainly not the case when we're talking about people who are humanists. Instead, these were often people who were interested in learning classical languages and trying to read the Bible in those original languages. People who were trying to interact between Christianity and ancient literature from Greece and Rome and so on and so forth, right? And there's interesting questions for us today. I mean, I think today one of the big questions that many people wrestle with is how culturally engaged the church should be, right? One impulse within the church is for us to kind of contract into our own subculture, to not interact with the popular subculture, right, or some of its historical elements because of godlessness or immorality and so forth. Well, if you think about Greek and Roman mythology, just to take one example, a lot of Greek and Roman mythology is filled with immorality. The Greek gods were not necessarily known as being paragons of virtue, far from it. Not only that, this really was a religion, right? So at some level, you're learning stories about, false gods who people worshipped as idols. So you can see why Christians might have reservations about people spending a lot of their time reading this stuff. On the other hand, there are other people who think, all truth is God's truth. And therefore, we need to figure out what Plato or what Aristotle or what, some of the great historians, Tacitus and so forth, what we can learn from them. But we don't just sort of uncritically absorb it. Instead, we try to filter it through what we know from Christianity, right? So you get competing views in that respect. I think that understanding humanism then also helps us to have a better understanding of Lutheranism. Luther is a very complex and interesting guy. And there are going to be some things about Luther probably that you really like, and I think some things about Luther that you're frankly going to be a little embarrassed about or appalled at in terms of some of the things he said, some of the things he held. But his influence on the history of Christianity is obviously immense. And so understanding him in some of those nuances, I think, is a really helpful thing, and will also help us understand more contemporary Lutheranism. So, for example, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is one of the most famous Lutheran theologians of the 20th century. And Bonhoeffer is prone to speaking in paradoxes. And I think he's prone to speaking in paradoxes because Luther was prone to speaking in paradoxes. Luther often seemed to think that paradoxical statements were the best way to capture the truths of the gospel. That we are simultaneously sinners and righteous, right? That paradox best captures the true message of the gospel, right? So as you understand Luther, you're going to understand more about Lutheranism and what develops after it. Now, here are some other things for you to be thinking about as you go through the reading. So there's a lot of disunity in the church in the 14th and 15th centuries. So think about this. How much of that disunity is the result of particular personalities and their choices? And to what extent it's instead structural? In other words, sometimes you can say, oh, I see. The reason why there's conflict is, this guy was a hothead. He offended this other powerful person. They were started feuding. They started, forcing people to ally with one side or the other. That's a very personality-driven explanation of the conflict. A different understanding of the conflict might be that there's something more structural going on. In other words, maybe they're just underlying differences in people's views of church hierarchy and church organization, right? And maybe things like that are really the issue, right? So in other words, if there's some people who believe all power should be concentrated within the church in the Pope, and other people think that plurality in leadership is more important. And so you want councils representing the entire church so that there's a plurality of people who are guiding the course of the church. At some level, there may be structural reasons why some people prefer one and some people prefer the other. And it's not really just personality conflicts. There's something deeper and more fundamental that's the cause for the conflict. So think about those kinds of things. Nationalism, right? To what extent is it personalities? To what extent is it because people's national loyalties to Italy or to France or to a particular region of Germany and so forth are crucial factors. Think about church and state issues. So, for example, what are some of the ways that Luther's success is dependent upon political calculations and alliances of the day? And many of the people who helped Luther may not have been doing so because they were fully convinced in his interpretation of Christianity or because they were particularly devout, right? So how as Christians should we think about that, right? And how do we think about God's providence during this time period? And how do we think about, for lack of a better phrase, Christians opportunistically making use of political power when it seems like they can take that political power and use it for some end that will benefit the kingdom of God? Here's another question you might think about. Suppose you meet someone and that person says that he or she has rejected Protestantism because they say Luther was a brutish, hot-headed anti-Semite who broke promises, rationalized polygamy, and encouraged the massacre of poor peasants. right? They just sort of unload all of that on you. Well, after you've read the chapter on Luther, think about how you would respond to that characterization of him, and how your characterization of Luther would fit in with your larger understanding of the nature of the church, the nature of grace, the nature of God's sovereignty, and so forth. You can think about also different approaches to reform, right? So, for example, you'll learn both about Erasmus and about Luther. In many respects, they have similarities, right? Their emphasis on the Bible, for example, their desire to see real reform take place within the Catholic Church. I mean, all of these are important similarities. But Luther was willing to make a fundamental break with the Catholic Church, while Erasmus really wanted to try to reform the system from within. What are the advantages and disadvantages of that? So be thinking about that in light of the reading from chapters 1 through 3.